My name is Seth Christensen. This is the Got Any Cows podcast. As Jonathan LaRue says, I may not know anything about anything else, but I do know a lot about cows.
You know cows.
I'm Seth Christensen here with the Got Any Cows podcast. Today we have got Shawn Powell with Forefront Genetics here with us. So Shawn, if you'll give us a little bit of an introduction as to who you are and what you do, that'd be great.
Okay. Like I said, Seth said, I'm Shawn Powell. I'm based out of Rexburg, Idaho. I went to Brigham Young University, Idaho. I have a bachelor's in animal science. So I got started in embryo transfer. I got really into the reproduction side of things. And my uncle is Kerry Powell, and he started off at BYU, and he did a lot of work there with their dairy program that they had back in the 80s. And then he moved to Ardema Dairy down in California, did a lot of embryo transfer there, and then started teaching at the college. And so right about close to graduation, about 2009, he said, hey, why don't we try and start a business with embryo transfer up close to Rexburg? He was tired of traveling so much and wanted to bring the donor animals to us instead of him traveling to the donor animals. So we started Forefront Genetics in 2010, January. Built a building, and we kind of use it. We have a dairy herd, so we kind of use some of our corrals spaces from our dairy to house donor animals at our facilities, and then flush them there. I was able to travel for a couple of years with him to kind of see how everything goes, get over all my hiccups and animals that are more difficult. And after a year or two of going around with them and watching under his tutelage, I started going out and doing some other animals on my own. So I am married. I have 5 kids. My oldest one currently is 15 and becoming quite the help on the farm. She's actually baling hay while I'm
That's awesome.
away here flushing cows. So
That's impressive. So the oldest is 15 and running the tractor at home, and you're down here getting the embryology work
yep.
done.
My youngest is 5, and she just started school. So
Awesome. So, Shawn, you do a lot of our in vivo embryo transfer work here, conventional embryo transfer work, and that'd be one of the most common questions that I get. People either A, haven't even heard of the difference between in vitro or IVF fertilization and conventional or in vivo work, or if they have heard of them, they don't understand at all what the difference is between the two technologies. They've heard of embryo transfer, but they don't understand the different methods of going about creating embryos, freezing embryos, transferring embryos. What is the difference, if you were explaining to somebody new to embryo transfer, between in vivo and in vitro embryo transfer?
okay, in vitro, which is becoming more and more common, they use an ultrasound and a needle, and they aspirate each of the follicles off of the ovaries. And then they collect them in a dish, and they mature them for a day, and then they fertilize them inside that dish and then they'll grow them for a week, and then that to see if they're viable. In vivo, which is commonly referred to as conventional embryo transfer, conventionally you are giving all the shots to stimulate the cow, so this is kind of the same process as in vitro. You stimulate the cow to have multiple follicles. The only difference is once you let the cow come into heat naturally, and then you fertilize it. My recommendation is 2 straws of semen, but there's some people that are they feel more comfortable with 3. Some programs do it that way. And so after that fertilization, you wait a week with the embryos being incubated inside the cow, and then we go through a process called flushing. And at that point, we're taking a catheter, we're threading the cervix, we're getting it inside the uterus, and then we run fluid, flush medium in and out, and at that point, we figure out what we have, see how much stimulation she has, how much embryos we actually recover, and then get them out. We can grade them there, and then either flush or freeze at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yep, yep. And we employ both in vivo and in vitro embryo transfer technologies here. Both have the same goal in mind of multiplying the very best animals or making more calves from the very best animals. But there are some animals that fit an in vivo application and are good candidates to be in vivo donors. And there are other animals that maybe don't fit in vivo, and so we go in vitro with those. So within our program here, the preference is to go in vivo if we can. Those embryos are generally going to be more cost effective. They're going to be more fertile, meaning just a higher success rate. When we transfer embryos, we usually see about 15% conception rate advantage with in vivo or conventional versus in vitro embryos. But not every animal is an ideal in vivo conventional donor candidate. So walk us through, if you were selecting donor candidates, what does the ideal candidate look like? And what are some traits that you would say disqualify an animal from consideration for in vivo embryo production?
The biggest thing with in vivo is the uterus. You have to make sure that the uterus is in good shape. There's sometimes animals that may have a lot of scar tissue or adhesions with the uterus. They're probably not going to be very good candidates for in vivo. You need to be able to pick up the tract and manipulate it, be able to get the fluid in, get the fluid out. And so sometimes that doesn't play with it. My ideal donor is 3 to 5 years old. If you're going the in vivo route, usually you've already hopefully had a calf or two. It is still possible to do heifers. It's a little bit more risky. What I have noticed with heifers is they're about 50-50. Some of them are really good and some of them are really poor, and it's really no consistency. After that first calf, they start getting a little more consistent, and then that 3 to 5 years of age, they become really consistent, and you know what they're going to be. So with that, what we typically do is we want, so typically we're talking about cows that have calved, and so we don't want to start anything until about 45 days post-calving. We need to have a good heat that makes sure that the uterus is all cleaned out, and that they're prepped and ready to carry another calf. And so at that point, we start the process, which takes about 16 days. So we try and shoot for around 60 days post-calving that we're making the first collection on those animals.
Yep. Yep. And those animals, like you mentioned, the kind of that 3 to 5 year old kind of a cow, one that she has had a calf, but is not already an old cow, tend to be our very best donor candidates and do a nice job. They do have to be open, meaning that the uterus has got to be available to grow those embryos. Just like you mentioned, that in an IVF application, they're growing for 7 days in a lab. In an in vivo, they have to be in the uterus, so it can't be a cow that's pregnant. And so that's what's worked really well for us as we've worked with you to make all those in vivo conventional embryos, is those middle-aged open cows that do a really nice job making embryos. We have done it with some virgin heifers historically, and just like you said, some really go well and others don't. And the thing that we've found here is that you can do it, and it kind of just depends on the individual. There's some animals that they flush hard and then they breed right up and there's no problem at all, but there is some risk of having females that don't want to breed if you flush them as a virgin heifer. So historically we have done a fair amount of that. We've done some heifers and worked on some flushes, and now at this point in time we're focusing on those ideal animals, just like you mentioned, a cow that's had a calf but she's not too old. All those cows in that sweet spot, they make conventional embryos for us. The cows outside of it, so a really young heifer or a really old cow, generally make in vitro embryos, is kind of how we've gone about it here.
Yeah, and this is, I guess, an important thing if you're looking at your embryo transfer program. If that just kills you to have a cow that's open, the in vivo is probably not going to be your best bet, because you need to recognize that cow is going to be off her schedule probably. You usually can sneak in one flush and then breed them right back up and get them on the same cycle, but you're limited on the amount of, because you can generally only use one bull. You can breed 2 bulls on the same flush, but you don't know which sire they're going to be. You're going to be doing a lot of DNA. That a lot of the donors that we deal with, their value is not in having a calf every year. Their value is making more than one calf every year. And so that makes it, I guess, on the in vitro side of things, you can do it while they're open, but there's a window where you can do it where you confirm them pregnant, 36, 37 days, you can start IVF on them and be able to collect up until they can't reach the ovaries, which is about 100 days, and they can do it a little quicker, about every 2 weeks in the process. So there's some considerations there, but like you said, the cost is going to be higher, and those are the things you're going to have to factor into your program, what those extra costs are going to be.
Right. And that's when we make the decision. We look at it like, given the opportunity, we will go conventional or we will go in vivo because the embryo is a little cheaper and the conception rate's a little higher. And so we're getting more bang for our buck on both fronts. The situations in which we'll end up in vitro is either the donor's too young or the donor's pregnant or the donor's too old, or in the case of really wildly expensive semen, a single unit in an in vitro application you can spread across a pool of donors, whereas like you mentioned with in vivo or conventional, we need a couple units of whatever the sire is for a single donor, for a single flush. So that ends up being just different fits for the different technologies for us.
Yeah, another consideration is cows will sometimes build up a immunity to the FSH, and so sometimes you can get away with on in vitro being able to not stimulate them. You can just aspirate the oocytes. You're going to get less numbers. But sometimes when you're going for conventional flushing, if they're only doing 1 or 2 conventionally, you might have to go the IVF route to get more out of them.
Right. Yep. So you just mentioned there, some different factors that'll impact embryo production success rate. One of them being if they build up a tolerance to FSH or follicle stimulating hormone, the drug that we use to superovulate those cows. What are some of the different factors at large, ranging, I guess, from nutrition to drugs to there's a whole fleet of protocol or factors, I should say, that'll impact success rate of these different donors as an embryo donor for their production. What would you say are some of the different factors to consider if someone is looking at a donor candidate, different factors that would impact her production ability?
The biggest one, I think, and it's hard to get the data on it, is probably genetics. You get a cow that if her entire family, all they ever do is 2 or 3 under IVF conditions, I would probably stay away from it because they're probably only going to be IVF candidates and you're only going to get 2 or 3 each time, which means your costs per embryo are going to be really high. And if you sink a lot of money into that, you're going to be constantly, I got to have one more one more embryo. I got to have one more embryo to make this work. And typically that doesn't work. Generally, I like to have, again, we talked about that 3 to 5 years old. But the biggest thing is the weight management. Sometimes these cows, you get them into an embryo program. Sometimes I've had guys that have conventionally flushed cows for well over a year. And at that point, there's nothing to draw them down. They're 5 years old. They're not growing. They're not raising a calf. They're not, they're just out there eating grass or eating hay, and it's really hard to keep the weight down on them. But so you kind of have to keep that in mind. If you can keep it 3 to 5 on the body score, they'll typically do better. You got to be able to work with them. If you can't run them into a chute, can't cut them off, and they're kicking like a mule to, every time you give them a shot, they're going to be really hard to work with. Typically, animals that have a lot of stress which is typically those that are running, that are hot, that hard to work with. It blocks the receptors for the follicle stimulant hormone, and so they generally don't respond. I've had several heifers that we've done that with, that you put your head over the panel and they just take off for the opposite corner of the fence and just always have to be in a group. You can't ever work them. They typically don't work very well. Yeah. But yeah, there's a lot of other things. The weight is the big thing, because animals that are not like healthy and gaining typically don't respond. So if you're like trying to pull weight off of them while you're doing embryos, you're it's kind of a counterproductive. The first thing that always goes is the reproduction. You'll see that with any animal. If you have a recip herd, or if you're just running them with the bulls, if you go out there and there's a cow that's super skinny, super, just doesn't have a lot of energy, she probably will be the one that doesn't breed up come preg checking time.
Right. And just like you mentioned, I mean, it does quite often follow in families, going back to your first comment on donor selection. The average donor here, and I've seen data to say the average donor nationwide, but for sure the average donor here is going to make 6 embryos, but that average comes from, there are donors that make no embryos at all, and there are donors that'll dump 30 plus in a single shot. And anywhere in between. A normal donor does 6, but when we identify a specific cow that say she does consistently do in the 20s or in the 30s for embryo production, you'll quite often see those daughters follow that trend. And so that's one of the things we kind of try to double down on, is maternal lines that we say these maternal lines are productive in an embryo transfer scenario, whereas there's other maternal lines where there might be other things to really recommend them, but they're hard to make embryos from. And that does tend to follow maternal lines to an extent. What do you see as far as, I guess, nutrition and mineral programs and their impact on embryo production capacity?
Again, when it goes to nutrition, the first thing out is reproduction. Yep. So I know there's a lot of guys that think, okay, there's a iodine salt lick block out in the pen, they're good on the minerals, which is fine if you have really good quality feed, but generally you're missing something, whether it's selenium, whether it's iodine, whether it's, there's a lot of different minerals. You don't need to go out and spend the most, get the highest quality product, but usually a good mineral package is very important for the animals. And you've seen that on your program here. Yep.
The Rio Max has done really well for us.
Yeah. And we need to get some sponsors, but
right, yeah. The Vitalix has done well for us, or the Crystalix, or whatever it may be. Yeah, and there's a fleet of tubs out there, or different mineral packs, different protein packs, or things that a beef producer could use. And I'm sure that there's things to recommend each of them. But we've been on the Rio Max, and it's gone well, and so we haven't changed. Not to say that there couldn't be plenty of other options that would do just as well, but the Rio Max has done a nice job, and so we continue to use it.
Yeah, and something local that works for your program is what I recommend. Right. You don't need to go all out, but I definitely have a good nutrition, definitely good feed. If you're feeding them straw and expect them to catch or take or embryos, this might be getting a little more onto the recipient side of things, but it's just kind of a well-rounded program. You have to. You can also take care of the donors just the best you possibly can, but if you don't take care of the recips on the other side, it's not going to do you any good on the conception rates.
Yep. No, and I have people quite often ask me, what's your guarantee on these embryos? And there's a lot of different approaches taken to that, within different breeds or within different portions of the industry, as far as how many pregnancies will guarantee for a set of embryos. We actually don't guarantee a specific rate, and the reason why is there's so much outside of our control beyond the embryo. I can have embryos that I know have stuck at a 60 or 70 or 80% clip here, that if they're sent to a set of recips that, like you mentioned, are being fed straw and are licking an iodine salt block and are implanted by someone that just went to a 3-day crash course in implants, they're not going to stick. I don't care how good the embryos were. And so there's a lot that goes into recip management. So if we were to take a look at that point in time, say that a new producer has either made embryos from their own donors, like what we've just talked through, making those embryos, or they've purchased embryos from another producer, and now it's coming time to get some recips set up and put together to put those embryos into, and recip being the term for a recipient cow that would function like a surrogate mother in people and would carry the baby or carry the embryo from the embryo donor. What goes into a successful embryo transfer program as far as taking those embryos and putting them into those recip cows?
Number one is, how did you handle those embryos? If you start off with dead embryos to begin with, you ran a tank dry, or the shipper didn't, you left them in the shipper for a week or 10 days, and it was kind of a little bit of vapor in there. You hope they stayed cold enough Or if you're out there looking at them before okay, yeah, that really is the embryo, and then you put it back into the tank, you're causing cells to die, and you're going to have a bigger struggle. So make sure you keep your embryos taken care of. And then it's just, you don't have to do everything at 100%. You just need to do everything 2 or 3% better. So you're going to you got to make sure you have the feed. You got to make sure your heat check's done right. Your shots are done on time and protocol. You know what a heat looks like, whether you have a guy that, your son or whatever knows, okay, this cow was in heat, or you start using products like Estrotec or some of those to go out there and say, okay, yes, those patches are rubbed, the cow's in heat. And then recording. Just, you can't have enough data. Recording, okay, this cow was in heat Sunday morning. Well, we're not doing transfers till Monday afternoon. I need to make sure that cow has a really old embryo. And for the most part, I haven't seen once you get inside like a window, like a day, you have a plus or minus 12-hour window of those embryos. And so typically on an embryo transfer day, you can show up and be like, okay, everything was in heat Monday. You can the stages and everything aren't going to matter as much. It's when you get those outliers, like, okay, we're trying to bring in that Sunday morning cow and we're still, Monday afternoon, or the opposite, we're taking one that's Tuesday afternoon. We got to make sure, we put a really young egg in there to give her the best chance.
Yeah.
So just it's just doing everything. Like, you can't,
right.
Like, you don't have to do, if you can get all the shots perfect, but if you don't watch the heats, then you're not going to do it. Again, this is my personal preference. There's a lot of people that like to just GnRH. They go through the program, anything that doesn't show heat, we GnRH, and then we hope our embryo technician the next week can tell whether that CL is from that GnRH shot, or was she in heat off schedule, and try and make that. So I typically don't like to transfer embryos into cows that haven't shown heat. Will you get some of those pregnant? Yes. Is it worth the value of the embryo? That's something that each operation is going to have to weigh.
Right. So looking at different kinds of cows that can be used as a recip, if you were selecting recips or had recommendations, okay, what category of cows do we start with, or what age or what group? How would you sort out the group of cows? Say I've got 20 cows and I'm going to transfer 5 embryos this year, and this is my first shot at it. Which of those cows are you going to pick to attempt to synchronize and implant embryos into?
If they're your own animals, it's kind of hard to know if you bought the recip cows. If they're your own animals, I would pick the very first 5 that show heat in the calving cycle, or the very first 5 that calve every year. It's typically, it shows that they have high fertility. If they're calving first of the cycle, right up at the front, those are typically going to be your best. I had a neighbor up there in Rexburg, and he's like, well, I got to get these embryos in. And we're like, okay. And he's like, well, I don't want to use all my good cows because they take every year, and we bred them up. And so he got down to the blast. He's like, well, I got 10 more. Let's just put it in these last 10. They're just starting to show heats and stuff. We put it in those 10. We got 1 out of 10 to take that year. Right. And the following year, we're like, he's like, I got 10 more. And we're like, just give us the first 10. And he was close enough that we just drove over to his house. We're like, tried to get him into a little group, 2 or 3 at a time, and we got 9 out of 10. Right. And so it's just the difference of the animals wanted to get pregnant, they were able to get pregnant, as opposed to those that are tail enders.
Right. And I think that's one of the common mistakes you see, is exactly that people take their culls, they take the bottom end of the set, like, well, this cow won't raise a good calf on her own, so I'm going to put an embryo in her. And you want to take your best cows is where you want to put those embryos into, exactly like you said. And it makes all the difference on how many of them stick. It makes all the difference in how good those calves wean off. It makes all the difference across the board. I mean, getting those cows that are good, proven, fertile cows. We use heifers as recipients as well. I wouldn't say it's my preference. I'd say our cows that are proven and that we know will breed quickly are our first choice, but you can successfully use heifers. What would you say when you're sorting on a pen of heifers? How do you go about determining this one is a realistic candidate as an ET recipient, and this one maybe we should wait or not use her for ET?
Probably size. Make sure that I've done some heifers that I can't get my arm in, and as you can tell, I'm not exactly a fat guy, so if I'm struggling to get in there, it's going to be harder to palpate, to maneuver, to pull things up. But typically those that are just cycling good every 21 days, if they're sporadic or something, there's not really a lot of point in trying to push them.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I mean, so in both cases, basically, it's the top of the heifers or it's the top of the cows. To use as good recipients. And then I think it does make all the difference. Animals that are well managed from a nutrition and mineral standpoint that we're not using. If the neighbor has a bunch of cull cows that they've never been AI'd or they've got no health history on or no reproductive history on, that we're just going to throw embryos that are worth $1,000 or $1,500 a pop at those cows isn't sound practice. And that's like I mentioned, that's the reason we don't obviously I will take care of anybody that if we had a real problem with the embryos and they didn't get a return on their investment, I'm going to take care of people. But that's exactly the reason we don't provide that express guarantee, is I'm not going to guarantee that you did everything perfect, because there's a lot, I would say more of what impacts success rate is recip management, recip selection, recip nutrition, recip health, recip age, recip sync protocol, recip heat detection, technician skill, handling, all of those things. I mean, don't get me wrong, the embryo can't be dead, like you said.
Yeah.
But if you combine all those other factors, they're going to have a lot bigger impact on your final conception rate than just the sheer quality of the embryo itself, I would say, as far as what's going to impact the final conception rate. You mentioned talking about heat detection and things like that, but I guess to even back up to synchronization, what kind of synchronization protocol do you prefer to put all of those recips in heat at the same time so that we can implant embryos? And I guess to insert a quick side note here, for anyone that's not familiar with the process, we synchronize cattle, and if we're going to AI them, then or artificially inseminate those animals, we'll do that 12 hours after, or with sexed semen 18 to 22, but roughly half a day after they express estrus. Whereas if we're going to implant embryos, it's 7 days post estrus, or like you mentioned, we can do 6 to 8 as long as we kind of match that stage a little bit. But if we're looking to synchronize those animals, put them all in heat the same day so we can implant a group of embryos, what protocols do you prefer for implanting those embryos?
My two biggest ones that I use, the one probably most common, just because it is quickest to get them in a group, is the 7-day co-sync plus cedar. It gets them in a good group, and it's tight enough that, where we have that 6 to 8 days that we're able to get enough of them in there. You usually get 85-90% of them to respond. The one I really like, if you have the time and the determination to do it, is the 7 and 7. It came out just a few years ago. We've had to tweak it a little bit. According to their program, they say, you have 3 days after that last shot is where they're all breeding and should have their heats. Just in the animals that I've done, we've had to shorten that to 2 days. So we have to plan that you're pulling them out on Saturday, they're going to be in heat Monday, not Tuesday. And I've actually had them pull them out Sunday, Monday or Saturday night, and they're already in heat Sunday afternoon. And so that's something that you're going to have to keep track of when scheduling your technician, because if your technician's busy on Monday and can't get there till Tuesday, and you had heats Sunday afternoon, you're going to be outside your window, and you're not going to be able to transfer some of those. So some of that's trial and error, knowing what works on your program. The thing I like about embryo transfer is typically people have known what how to do shots, how to do sync protocols, because they're generally AIing cows. They've started that. They've gone through all the bumps. AIing is a very cheap way to learn what a protocol looks like, what a heat looks like, and then you're using cheaper semen to get all that experience. And then all you do with embryo transfer is you take that experience and you wait 1 week,
right,
and turn it into your embryo transfer program.
Yep. And an ET is one of those things. I mean, obviously we're sitting down looking to explain it so people can understand and people can apply some of these different recommendations or ideas or thoughts or our experiences to what they're trying to do. But I do think it's important that people grasp, ahead of time, it isn't something you should probably just jump into with no background at all. If you jump straight to ET and you haven't already dialed in health management, we haven't already dialed in nutrition management, we haven't already dialed in just even a natural service breeding program where we're getting cattle pregnant consistently just with a live cover bull, and then into something like AI and applied reproductive management where we're synchronizing estrus and we're going to artificially inseminate those cattle all at once, and then maybe progress to an ET program. It's not to say you can't do it all in one shot, but it's about like going and signing up to go play a game of Olympic basketball like straight out of Little League. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense to not have progressed or gained some experience at some different levels as you go along. And it's I mean, if you get a good technician, so just like, I lean on you as a consultant here, and somebody I can call and ask and get input on all of these million different facets, because they all impact success rates. They all impact the bottom line. And the embryo transfer program is the center of what we do here. And so it has to be successful. So we're always trying to dial in and tweak and adjust different components of it. But I think it's important that people grasp it. It is a complex system and that there are a lot of little pieces that need to be done right. So if you're going to do it right out of the gate, study, prepare, learn all you possibly can, listen to somebody who knows, talk to somebody who's done a lot of it, and realize there's a lot of factors that need to be controlled if you're going to have a successful embryo transfer program. Just buying embryos, buying cows, and calling a technician and shotgunning it, don't expect great success rates in that kind of a scenario. Hey guys, this is Seth Christensen with the Got Any Cows podcast. I wanted to give you guys a personal invitation to check out our website. That's gotanycows.com. Gotanycows.com is going to take you to the Christensen Genetics website. On that website, we've got a couple of different things that I would like you to take advantage of. One of the first tabs that you'll see there across the top on the Christensen Genetics website is the podcast tab. You can find any and all of the episodes that have been released there along with full video. The next tab over would be the Learn tab. The point of everything on this tab would be to help educate somebody that maybe doesn't have cattle yet, help you prepare to be ready to own your own cows. We help people on a regular basis establish new herds, build a quality set of cattle. The Learn tab is all about being ready for cattle ownership. The next tab that you'll see on the top of the website there is the Build Your Herd tab. This is going to have our current sale inventory on it. It'll have everything from semen and embryos to females, bulls, all of the above. It's all there. There's going to be pictures there. There's going to be registration links there. There's going to be pricing there. All of the live animals on christensengenetics.com come with free delivery anywhere in the continental United States included. So if you decide to purchase any of these animals, all you have to do is click the click to buy button that is included on each of those listings. That'll send an email to us. We'll send an invoice to you. Once you pay that invoice, we'll go ahead and schedule a brand inspection, a health inspection, and shipment to your ranch. And then after that, the next tab is the Run Your Ranch tab. So this would be where you can find information on what to do when you receive those animals, vaccination protocols, nutrition recommendations, calving recommendations, shipping, marketing, anything that you might need to do once you own the cattle. So the whole point of this website at large of gotanycows.com is meant to help you prepare to own cows, purchase the best cows you can possibly get, and then know what to do with them. So I'd invite you guys to take advantage of that resource. We built it for you. It's there to use. Please go ahead and visit gotanycows.com. Be sure to subscribe at the bottom of the page and you'll receive updates as things are added to the site. Again, that's gotanycows.com, and we'll see you there. And so I guess with that being said, I mean, what is a realistic expectation in a well-managed embryo transfer program if we're sticking in fresh conventional embryos versus frozen conventional, versus fresh IVF versus frozen IVF? What's a realistic expectation for a well-managed program?
Well, you probably could go off your data a little bit more, but if you're doing conventional fresh embryos, so what we mean by fresh embryos is we have synchronized all the recips and the donors up to be, so we collect on that day, we go into the lab, we search those embryos, we pull out all the good ones, we load them right into straws, and we transfer them that day. There's typically a little bit higher, a little bit wider window for your transfer times, just because they are fresh.
Right.
If you're doing that on the same day, you're looking at about 65% conception rate. I will say there is days that you're going to hit home runs at, what was our last year, 80, 85,
Yeah, we've
86?
had different groups. Yeah, 85, 89, 90 plus. I'd have to look back there and see exactly what the number was, but it was high.
Yeah, and the nice thing I like about it, it wasn't just like on one or two, because you can always fool the numbers. Like, we got 2 for 2, But we're talking groups that are 30, 40 head, so we have large numbers. But there's going to be those 80, 90 days, and then there's also going to be those 30 days. So you need to make sure in your program that you can absorb that. If you have to have 90% conception rate, you're probably not going to hit that all the time. There's guys that run higher than 65 all the time, but it's not always. If you freeze those those conventional embryos, you're losing about 10% conception, so you should be somewhere around that 55. With the IVF, I really like if you can do fresh IVF embryos. I think you're only losing about 5 to 10% off that conventional. So you should be around that, 55, maybe even 60 pretty consistently. But if the frozen IVFs, you could probably attest to this more, but I generally see 35, 40%. On really good programs, you can get up that 55% on the frozens. But again, everyone's doing everything on their program. They're, they've done that 3% on everything better, and they start off with a really good program, and so to bring IVF embryos into it, they're able to keep those numbers up.
Right. That the most common disappointment I see is somebody that is brand new to cows, so they're trying to learn the cattle management side, and they're brand new to applied repro, so they're trying to learn synchronization and all of those other components like age, recip selection, all of those different things, just knowing even which animals to set up. They're trying to learn heat detection, they're trying to learn AI and or ET, and they're doing it all with frozen IVF embryos and expecting to get 65% because they've heard 65 is a normal number in some embryo transfer scenarios. And then they're distraught when they get 25%. But that's more common than not. If somebody is brand new to all of it, so nothing's ever been dialed in prior, and they started with frozen IVF embryos, that's a tough place to start. Our data here, you're going to see over the years, I'd have to go back and get the exact tally, but it's thousands of total observations as far as total of embryo implanted over the course of the last 6 years. And on average, we're going to see about 70% conception here for a fresh conventional transfer. We're going to see roughly 55 whether we do frozen conventional or whether we do fresh IVF. They're similar, 55, 60, or you can be a hair under 55, 52 sometimes. Frozen IVF averages to about 40%. And there's little subsets where every single one of them sticks. I get 4 embryos, I got 4 pregnancies. And there's times you get 4 embryos and I got no pregnancies. But if you boil out across large subsets, you're about 40% on frozen IVF for just a realistic expectation. And I think it's important that people understand when it comes to embryo transfer, there's the cost of the embryo, and sometimes we get excited because it's a lot cheaper to buy the embryo than it is to buy a live, living, breathing, ready-to-go donor or high-caliber genetic piece, period. But when we look at the price tag, if that's all we evaluate is like, wow, this embryo is really cheap. And don't get me wrong, embryos can be a very viable option. I buy embryos, we sell embryos, we work with a lot of people that do embryos. But if you're only evaluating the cost of the embryo relative to the cost of the finished animal, you're ignoring most of the costs, which are the recipients that you buy, all of the open recipients that you feed, all of the open recipients that you've implanted, all, you know, and the fact that they're all going to calve later if they don't stick to the embryo. And so I think it's just important. I want people to go in and have successful embryo programs, but I think that that's important to go in with your eyes wide open as to some of the risks associated, some of the costs associated, and understand that there's a reason why our very most popular thing we sell is confirmed embryo transfer pregnancies. And it's because it's difficult to establish confirmed embryo transfer pregnancies. And so, I mean, you can be ahead if you're not willing or able to put in all of the time, all of the effort into selecting a good set of recips, into giving them every chance to conceive, into controlling a million different variables because you're busy with a million different things like we all are. It's not realistic to come and say, well, I'm going to stick 90% of these frozen IVF embryos into these cows I know nothing about. I think it's important to come in just eyes wide open, you know, and realize here's some realistic benchmarks if you control everything just so. And if you're not wanting to control everything just so, you may be better off either buying confirmed pregnancies or buying calves already on the ground, or buying a live animal versus going to the embryo transfer route. If you do go with embryo transfer and go ahead and decide to do that, another common question I get is stages and grades of embryos. What are they? You've mentioned them previously a little bit on stages, but yeah, what are they and why do they matter? When do they matter a lot? And when do they not matter as much? Stages and grades of embryos.
So if you look at a straw, they typically have two numbers. It's going to have a 1 through, I think the highest one I've seen is a 9 on the first number. That is the stage of the embryo. And on the second number, they grade them 1 through 4. You don't want any 4s. 4 is considered degenerate or trash. They're poor. The number 1 is the best grade, which means that there is 0 to 15% of the cells are extruded from the embryo itself. A grade 2 is that 15 to 50, and then grade 3 is that has 50 to 70%. So there's only 35% viable material that's still there, and grade 4 they're just usually all loose. So typically when you buy embryos, I've only ever really seen grade 1s and 2s. 3s have your conception rate drops dramatically on the 3s. Not saying that if you keep some of those 3s yourself, you're able to use them, but you have to take into cost of the embryos. So the stages, on getting back to the front number, is a 1 through 9. So stage 1 is you just fertilized it and it starts splitting, and then you get up stage 2 and 3. It's just what stage 2 is doing some more divisions around that 4 to 16 cells. Stage 3, you're getting that over 32, and it starts looking up what they call an early morula. And so it's just a really, really young age. It's kind of hard to tell them in the microscope because they're still kind of big and clumpy, but you're like, oh yeah, that it's adhesed, it's still good together. 4 is a morula, and then it just starts getting older. So you're talking, stage 4, you're somewhere around 5.5 days, and then stage 5 is early blastocyst. Stage 6 is a blastocyst. Stage 7 is an expanded blastocyst. So this is just getting further and further along. And then a stage 8 is actually, the embryo has a zona pellucida, which is around the outside. So stage 8 is it has expanded far enough that it breaks out of that zona and is now hatched. And then a stage 9 is it's expanding after it hatched out of that zona. Typically, you'll only ever see stage 8s on IVF embryos. I have seen some of them frozen. Quite often you'll see those fresh IVF just because they're continuing to grow while they're shipping, and so they're going through all the normal process. They usually ship stage 6s, 7s, and 8s in the IVF world. But when you go to conventional, we try and do it, that we like to have them 4 to 6. So occasionally we see those stage 7s. But again, if you're looking at it, you want grade ones are the best. Personally, if the technician was really good and graded them really well, I've been told that some of my twos, just in being a little bit more critiquing on the embryos, they take just as well as the ones. And so quite often there's some value there that you can negotiate down that grade 2. Hey, I'm taking a grade 2 because usually you don't buy these. You usually only sell grade 1s. You're going to get about a 5% reduction in conception, but hopefully you can whittle down the seller to get a little better price on those grade 2s. But I think they're still good embryos depending on where you get them from. Again, you have to where they're at, kind of thing. But.
Mm-hmm. And as we look at it on the stages, the most common, like you mentioned, are from stage 4 to stage 8, and we will use those to match them to specific days. Like you mentioned, if you come as the technician and you're scheduled for a given day, like you mentioned, if everything came in heat exactly 7 days prior, it doesn't matter a whole lot of any at all what stage goes into what animal. If they're 7 days later, you've got enough swing, enough reach off either end of exactly when they came in heat relative to exactly when they're being implanted 7 days later, you can kind of put any given embryo into a seven day post-heat cow. Now, to take advantage of your cows that are 6 or 8 days post-estrus, we try to kind of match the youngest and the oldest embryos to the youngest and the oldest heats. And so in that case, we're going to put a stage 4 or a stage 5 embryo into those 6 days or 6.5 day heats. And we're going to put in a stage 7 or even a stage 8 embryo into the cows that are 7.5 or 8 days post-heat. Or if we don't have, the grades sitting right handy, for just basic rule of thumb, like you mentioned, your IVF embryos are often older stage embryos, so we'll put the IVF embryos into the oldest heats, and we'll put the conventional embryos into the youngest heats if we're just matching them basic. And then on the grades, like you mentioned, most all the time it's grade 1 or grade 2 for that second number. And it's important to differentiate between the two. It matters a lot. The stage, if you see a 4, 5, 6, or 7, you don't need to be worried about that impacting quality. It's just age. Whereas the second number, 1 and 2 are acceptable, 3 is not. And 1 and 2, sometimes I think, like you mentioned, people are really concerned about a grade 2, like, oh man, there's no way this is going to stick. And the difference, there is a difference there. They are a different embryo, but we've made a lot of calves from grade 2 embryos. And so just understanding that, like Shawn said, you might be able to negotiate a little better purchase price, but that you shouldn't be concerned like, oh, I'm only ever going to buy a grade 1. Like a grade 2 can be a real buy, especially if the price is adjusted at all. But you can definitely make pregnancies from grade 2 embryos.
But I guess on that side, if you're looking to sell embryos, recognize that grade 1 is what everyone is expecting.
Right.
And grade 2s are, you're probably going to have to reduce
probably
the
going
cost.
to have to discount them to sell them.
Or give a better guarantee or something, because you are, sometimes you end up with a pile of 2s and not very many 1s. And so you got to move some of those somewhere sometimes.
So if somebody calls you and says, hey, I've got embryos and I've got a set of cows to put them in and I need you to make it happen, how much heads up do you need? So, obviously part of that is just your schedule, but just to physically get the protocols done between the time somebody calls you and the day that you're going to physically show up and put the embryos in the cows, how much lag is there? What should somebody be expecting when they call a technician trying to get a day scheduled to put embryos into cows?
So the quickest you're ever going to get is probably, 17 days, I'd say, is kind of, if you're going to sink them all. There is a little bit quicker. You're only going to be able to get 66% of them, is if you go out there and just estrumate or lutealize the recip herd, and then they're going to show heat 3 days later, and then you're going to be able to transfer. So you can get it done in 10, but that's like panic mode. Hopefully, you don't know how many you're going to get there. So you can do it in 17 days. And it's all going to come down to your technician's availability time at that point. I've heard of some technicians that you're 3 to 6 months out before you get a date, and then they're going to cap you at the number that you can do, because they're busy enough that they can't physically get there. And so that would be the quickest. And then you can get further out. You can get different protocols, different, like we talked about the 7 and 7. That takes an extra week over the co-sync, and so it's all about what you're comfortable with in your operation. But you definitely need to look down the calendar. I need to calve at this time. The embryos need to go in here.
Right. Yep. And I think if somebody is I think at a minimum you need to be a month in advance, and that's both to have really any chance of getting on a good technician's schedule. Give them a month's heads up, and that gives you enough time. If you did a 7 and 7, you're already out to 24 days between the day you start the protocol and the day the embryos go in. And if it takes you any time at all to get help lined up, to get your cattle in the chute, to get started, to get the drugs gathered up, to figure out a plan, if that takes any time at all, you're already out to that month window, from the day you get on the phone and get this all planned and scheduled to the day you're actually transferring embryos. So after somebody has transferred embryos, how far after transfer day can they schedule a vet or an ultrasound technician to come in and ultrasound those cows for pregnancy status?
So typically, if you're doing ultrasound, you're talking 28 days if the technician's good. If the technician's good at preg checking just by palpating, you're talking 36 days is what I would do. So yeah, I'd and one more thing just that I thought of. When you're doing embryo transfer, as you talked about gathering up everything, gather your embryos at your place before the transfer day. There has been multiple occasions that I have stressed, because you showed up and they're like, oh, the shipper is at the UPS store. We want these embryos in. We're going to get them, we got to go pick them up before we can put them in. Well, what happens when UPS shows up one day late? Now you don't get those embryos in. And a lot of times that's like, oh, we called them this week. We need to have them in 3 days. Well, Transova or Vitelli or the guy I'm buying these embryos from, his shipper is at the guy that said he needed it in 3 days. And so he's got to wait for his shipper to come back before he can send it back to you. And so realize that there is some time frame there.
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I hadn't even thought to put it on the outline, but that's a fantastic point to mention. Frozen embryos and their shipping timeline, it is not Amazon 2-day delivery. That is not how it works. If you're buying embryos, they're going to come in a liquid nitrogen vapor shipper. Those vapor shippers, especially in the spring and fall breeding seasons, are really hard to come by, because everybody that ever buys anything frozen, semen or embryos, they require those shippers. Any of these facilities only have so many shippers, and that shipper is tied up from the time they pack it to the time UPS delivers it to wherever it may be going. And if it goes coast to coast, it's at least 4 days. And then somebody's got to unpack it and get it back to a UPS or FedEx guy, and it's another 4 days back across the US. And that's assuming everybody gets it done same day, unpack, back out. So I mean, it's tied up for 8 days on each of these loops, because they're not cheap to ship. So almost nobody, that's not true. I was about to say almost nobody. There's plenty of overnight and 2-day shipments that happen because they're in such tight supply, or everybody ends up on such tight timelines, but it's not cheap. Even ground shipments, I tell people budget $150 by the time you're going to move this shipper from here to the opposite corner of the country and back again. The thing weighs 30 pounds, about 3 feet tall. It's not cheap to move these things. And so you need to give yourself plenty of lead time on that, because I know for these poor folks that work at these facilities that pack and ship and distribute frozen genetics get so frazzled when nobody will call all summer long, or nobody will call all winter long, and then we get right into peak breeding season and everyone needs it tomorrow. Like, oh, my technician's coming tomorrow. Like, oh, we've already got CEDARs out of the cows or whatever, or we've already got the day scheduled or whatever it is that's going on. It's happening tomorrow. And you've got your frozen genetics sitting, in the opposite corner of the country from where you are. It isn't going to get there. And so I think that's a great point to mention. Probably the day you schedule your technician, meaning at least a month in advance, you had better call and make sure that you have scheduled your shipment. And when you call and talk to those people at the shipping facility, tell them what day the embryos are going in or the semen's going in, because they'll quite often prioritize, because they are so tight on shipper availability, they'll prioritize based on who needs them the fastest. So call them, give them a month so they've got time to work, get the shipper tracked down, cool it down, ship it to you, return it, and just give yourself plenty of time for the fact that UPS loses stuff and they're 1, 2, 3 days late all the time, and it's there's just not any way around it short of driving across the country to get it. And so, yeah, give yourself plenty of lead time on shipping frozen genetics. I think that's a fantastic point.
Or if you sometimes have it, like, even if you just double check that it's in your tank, like, oh, I thought I shipped that.
Yes.
No, I didn't. It's
Right. Yes.
I have showed up that they're like, yeah, I have half of the embryos, but I don't know where the other half went.
Right. No, absolutely. Well, and the same I've had it happen before, where embryos that I thought were sitting in my name at a given storage facility didn't get transferred by the seller into my name, and then they got resold. And so I thought I had them, but I didn't have them, and then they're gone. And so if you buy frozen genetics, I would recommend, by and large, buy them, ship them, have them in your tank, have them there handy. And I say this, somewhat hypocritically, because I mean, I am just as guilty as anybody. Think, no, I don't need them, don't ship them. But it's cost me. It's cost me the embryos before. It's cost me time before. It's made me implant my second most preferred embryos before versus my top picks. Definitely recommend giving yourself plenty of lead time. We were talking about pregnancy diagnosis. You can ultrasound 28 days of pregnancy. Realize that the embryos going in are already 7 days old, and so you can if you're going for the most aggressive approach, you can have an ultrasound technician in the cows 3 weeks after implant day, but they have to have an ultrasound. They're not going to be able to do that with just manual palpation. And there will be cows that are pregnant at 28 days that are no longer pregnant at 40 days or 60 days or 90 days. It's a smaller and smaller percentage that won't carry the farther out you preg check them. A cow that's confirmed pregnant at 120 days of pregnancy is relatively bulletproof. One that's been confirmed at 28 days, there's a chunk of those that aren't going to carry. They will be pregnant that day. They're no longer pregnant further into gestation. So I think an important thing to understand there. So just to kind of wrap it up, anything that you would recommend if somebody's looking to use the same set of cows a second time, as far as just kind of a resync protocol to do 2 implant dates? If you got one set of cows, we're going to implant them all once. The ones that don't take, we're going to use a second time for a resync. How would you recommend going about that? And then I guess any closing thoughts that you think ought to be thrown in, other things I've missed, like the shipping timelines.
If you're going to do it really aggressive and you have the time, and I realize a lot of beef guys aren't going to have this kind of time or thoughts, you can put a cedar back in to the animals about 7 days after, and then you would wait a week and then just pull the cedar. You wouldn't give any you'd give GnRH to start with to put the cedar in, but you would bypass the lutalize, because you don't want to lutalize all the possible pregnant cows. Right. So what you're doing with that cedar is you're just starting a new follicular wave, taking it past, up to when they would about have heat, and then you could pull that cedar and then have them, those that are going to come up open, they'll be in a tighter window. Typically what we've done here is, so these are 7 days post heat. In 2 weeks, those that are going to come open typically show there. There are some that are going to go 28 days and then show heat on day 28. Those are early embryonic deaths. So there's not a whole lot you can do about that. They did take, but then they aborted it. Like you said, you're going to have those that are going to go out 50 days and abort, but it starts getting smaller and smaller. But you could just set up a date that's 3 weeks, and then you're going to have some that are going to land outside that window. You can just go for transfers that day. Yep.
And that's what we end up doing here is we schedule our biggest dates the first week of December, because we're targeting September calves. So we do one big transfer date there. Everything's synchronized with that 7-day co-sync or the 7 and 7 protocol that you mentioned. We've used both. we're going to do a big implant date, and then we've got Shawn scheduled to be back in 3 weeks. And like you mentioned, there's going to be some that fall outside the window for whatever given reason, but a good chunk of the cows that did not take that first embryo will be back in heat 3 weeks later. And so if Shawn comes 3 weeks after the date he first came, he can implant another set of embryos into the same set of cows. And that mostly just comes down to having good heat detection, because if I know exactly when the cow came in heat, whether that's with an estrotect patch, whether that's with manual observation, whether that's with a cow manager heat detection system, whatever it may be, but I've got to know, was she in heat Wednesday or was she in heat Sunday? I mean, like if we've got something smaller, like, well, was it Sunday AM or Sunday PM, we've got a little bit of latitude to work. But if I don't know if it was the middle of the week or the end of the week when she came in heat, I'm going to botch the success rate of the project before you ever put an embryo in a cow, because we don't know how many days post-estrus she is. So when you get it to the cows, natural estrus cycle is 18 to 24 days on average, averaging at 3 weeks at 21 days. So if somebody watches, they got all the heats, you implanted a week later, and then 2 weeks after you implanted, or 3 weeks after their last heats, in that 18 to 24 day window, watch for heats again, mark them all carefully, and then you come again a week after there. So 3 weeks from the time you last implanted, you're there again. And I have a list of heats for you that came in heat at this time.
Yeah.
I think that's crucially important, for you, so that you don't come in and have somebody say, oh, that technician didn't know what he's doing, or somebody calling me saying, oh, those embryos weren't any good. Like, oh, I had no idea when they were in heat or if they were in heat. We just implanted embryos into cows, and that's not doing anybody any favors.
And we've done a few projects here that was on a cooperator herd that the guy worked, and it was like, okay, well, the patches rubbed off. Was that Tuesday or was that Friday? And correct me if I'm wrong, but that project was the lowest conception rate. Usually. But
right.
We recognized we didn't use really expensive embryos. This was back in the Angus, when you were doing Angus a lot, and so you recognize that, hey, I'm not putting in my $1,500 embryo in this thing.
Right. Good heat detection, I think, is crucial. Anything else in particular, Shawn, that you think ought to be thrown in for somebody that's just starting into ET?
The biggest thing I would say is your technician's going to have a lot to do with it. So don't try and do the best you can in researching, who your technician is. Like, are you, they've been doing it for a while, and then if you're in the world, talk to some other people that possibly have used him, or who does, someone who has a really successful program, who are they using, are they available for you? I realize that in some parts of this country, I got a guy that calls me from West Virginia. He's like, yeah, my closest technician's 4 hours away, and that's the only one around. And so he's kind of stuck, locked in. Fortunately, I think one moved a little bit closer, but he has a small group of cows, and it's hard to get a good technician there.
Sure.
And if you look around, even in our area, there's not a lot of technicians that are here. And so if you can find one that has some good programs, you talk to the people that they worked with, and try and get in with those, and then you're just going to have to see, and don't be afraid to, possibly branch out, and you might have to try one or two different technicians and see if it's the technician, is it your feed program, is it your embryos that you're putting in. Just, there's a lot of different variables.
You bet. Well, I sure appreciate you putting in all those words of advice and giving all the experience that you have and shared here, Shawn. And if anybody wants to reach out to Shawn, we'll leave your contact info in the show notes on this show. Appreciate you coming on and sharing all that with us. And if anybody has any further questions or wants to follow up after this episode, check out gotanycows.com. We've got information on embryo transfer there. You'll be able to watch previous episodes of the podcast there. You can always reach out to me at any time or reach out to Shawn. And appreciate you being here, Shawn. Thanks much.
You betcha.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Got Any Cows podcast. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. And visit us anytime at gotanycows.com.